Hey everyone, and thanks for jumping back into the cryptoverse. Today, we're going to talk about Bitcoin in lockstep with the Nasdaq. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up, and also check out the sale on the premium list at intothecryptoverse.com. We've talked about this relationship many times, but namely, it's that the Nasdaq and Bitcoin are more or less moving in lockstep. And one of the things we noted yesterday when we said that Bitcoin was likely going to be trending back down for a little bit, the reason we said that was because we saw the Nasdaq closing down so far yesterday at the close. Okay, so when we put out that video yesterday and I was talking about expecting lower prices, it wasn't really that complicated. It's just say, look, guys, the NASDAQ is putting in lower prices, and it stands to reason that Bitcoin is probably going to react accordingly because, as we know, Bitcoin very much operates right now as a risk-on asset, whether we like it or not, right? I mean, it doesn't matter if we want it to be risk-on or risk-off. It operates as a risk-on asset. And one of the things we've seen today is we very much saw Bitcoin follow the NASDAQ down. And what's further interesting though is today the Nasdaq has actually bounced back up a little bit. It's now up about 1% on the day. Obviously, the day is not over yet, so it's hard to say where it's ultimately going to end up. But if you look at the Nasdaq and compare it to Bitcoin, you can see that in fact, the Nasdaq also put in a local top in November as well, and it's ever since it's been in a 3-month downtrend more or less. And so one of the interesting things that we maybe can learn from the Nasdaq chart is to get an idea of what history shows us recent corrections have been like. So if we just go back and look to see what the Nasdaq has done over the last several years, you can in fact see that there have been several corrections that are on par with this one. This was a correction that was about a 23 or 24% drop over the span of 3 months. We had one back during the pandemic, which obviously didn't last very long, but it was still a 30% drop over about 5 weeks. And then so far in this one, we've had a drop of approximately 22% over the span of approximately 13, well, maybe it's not quite 13 weeks, 12 weeks. Okay. So one of the things to keep in mind here is that the NASDAQ, while it does have fairly brutal corrections, and frankly speaking, if you go back further in time, you can find even more brutal corrections. Like if you go back to the financial crisis, the NASDAQ, as we know, dropped. Here it dropped 54%, but that wasn't even the worst one. We also had this one back in 2000 where the NASDAQ in fact dropped 83 or 84%. So fairly significant drops that the NASDAQ has previously seen. But in recent times, these types of corrections or bear markets for the NASDAQ are actually fairly standard, and they tend to pop up every so often. Okay, so the time frame between, say, this one right here and the next one was approximately 72 weeks. And then the time frame between this one and then the one we're currently experiencing was approximately 92 weeks. So these cycles, whatever you want to call them, right, they do play out from time to time. And you can see that this one was maybe a year and a half in between, and this one was closer to 2 years, but still not quite 2 years in between these 20 to 30% corrections. Now, one of the interesting things with the NASDAQ getting these 20 or 30% corrections is that it does tend to unlock new buyers, okay? And you have to think there are people that sit on the sidelines and they like to buy up, they like to buy up Bitcoin, they like to buy up NASDAQ whenever they consider it to be on sale. And one thing to consider is that when the NASDAQ is down 20%, I would imagine that there are at least some buyers out there. And you can see that we have a pretty nasty wick here that took us all the way down. And since then, the NASDAQ has moved back up off of this low, which is close to breaking 13,000 on the NASDAQ here. So what I'm sort of following right now is, what is the NASDAQ going to do? I think it gives us a fairly nice blueprint of what Bitcoin is going to do in the short term. I am actually somewhat impressed with how well Bitcoin has held up today, given how bad it got for the NASDAQ. I think it held up relatively well. But if the NASDAQ, say, gets another bounce off of these lows, you can see it came down here, put in a wick, and then it had a bounce. and then it got rejected by the bull market support band. If the Nasdaq gets another bounce up, we're going to have to see yet again, is it going to get rejected and put in a lower high, or will we be able to resume the uptrend? So that's what I really think is worth following right now, to see what is the Nasdaq going to do. And whatever it does, I think it's fairly safe to assume that Bitcoin will more or less act in kind. Okay, it's not going to follow it exactly, nothing ever does. But if the Nasdaq looks good, I think that'll translate to Bitcoin. If the Nasdaq looks bad, I think that'll translate to Bitcoin. And so I do think keeping an eye on some of these traditional markets does make a lot of sense, given their recent correlation. They're certainly not always correlated. But one thing to consider, if you are, if you like Bitcoin like me, is that every parabolic rally by Bitcoin has always happened when the Nasdaq is in an uptrend. Okay, so like for instance, in the grand finale over here we had in March and April, and then in December of 2017, the Nasdaq was in an uptrend during those times. Here's like earlier 2021, March and April, we're in an uptrend off a very major macro uptrend. Also going back to December 2017, you can see that the Nasdaq did not put in a local high at that area, but it was in fact in an uptrend. And if you go to Bitcoin's prior peak at the end of 2013, you can see a very similar story, right? Like the Nasdaq was in an uptrend the same time that Bitcoin was putting in a local top. So I think that, I know a lot of people here are not that interested in traditional markets, but I would implore you to become interested in them, because if we want to see Bitcoin go on a nice rally again, we need to see the Nasdaq recovering. Okay, and we need to see this thing, getting some legs and actually taking out some of these levels and coming back up and doing something like this. One thing I would like to say though, since I have your attention on Bitcoin, for those that are invested in the stock market, I think most people know in the stock market that during deep corrections, that is not the time to panic sell. That is typically the time to DCA into the market. So I do not look at major pullbacks in the market like these as reasons to panic sell my equities. I just look at them as opportunities to continue to DCA into the market. And I don't really think it needs to be any more complicated than that. And I understand that it's cliche to say DCA and whatnot, but really with index funds, it does typically work out. I mean, I understand that the prior generation would say, we'll go back and look at 2000 to 2008, and I do understand that was a fairly brutal time. But I also kind of come from the perspective of I'd rather just generally assume that the market is going to trend higher than constantly live in fear that it won't. And so when I look at traditional markets, I generally just assume they trend higher, and I look at major pullbacks, generally speaking, as opportunities. I mean, of course, it's impossible to know if we're going to be bouncing off of these lows and not revisiting them, but there is always a chance. And I am impressed how well Bitcoin has held up so far, considering that the Nasdaq put in a lower low. I mean, it certainly does not mean that Bitcoin won't put in a lower low, but this bounce by the Nasdaq off of its low down here, I'm kind of surprised Bitcoin has not yet followed suit. But regardless, you can see that when one of them's moving up, you tend to see the other one moving up. When one of them's moving down, you tend to see the other one moving down, and so on and so forth. So we'll continue to follow it. We'll continue to see if the Nasdaq can, in fact, make a break back up to its bull market support band. And if it can, that'll be a key test to see, can we reclaim it? And if that happens, then I do think that will be good for the crypto market. If you guys like the content, make sure you subscribe to the channel, give the video a thumbs up. I'll see you guys next time. Bye.